And today's webinar will provide an overview of problematic invasive species in North Texas and information on how to manage them, as well as a discussion on zebra mussels and efforts to eradicate them from Lake Waco. And without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our first speaker, Rachel Richter. Rachel is an urban wildlife biologist for the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. She has a bachelor's degree in Wildlife and Fisheries Science from Texas A&M and a master's degree in Wildlife Ecology from Texas State. As an urban wildlife biologist, she focuses on making our communities more wildlife friendly through educational outreach and providing technical guidance. And so, Rachel, you may go ahead and begin your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for tuning in this afternoon. So my presentation is going to focus on problematic plant and animal species in the DFW area and how they impact water quality and what y'all can do to try and manage these species. If you could go ahead, next slide, please. So starting with the basics, an invasive species is any living thing that is not native to that particular area, and it also causes harm to either the environment, the economy, or human health. So there's lots of ways that invasive species can cause problems, and they're also difficult to control because they typically grow, spread, and reproduce very quickly, and they can overtake native species that live in that area. And they cause a lot of damage, and they're a very costly problem to have. They do an estimated $137 billion in damage in the United States every year. So I'm going to talk about plants first, but there's a lot of invasive plant species, and I don't have the time today to go and talk about specific plant species. So I'm going to focus instead on kind of the importance of vegetation to water quality and how invasive plants can disrupt that, and then talk about management a little bit. So if you're not already aware, native plants are really important to water quality. One of the primary reasons is that our native plants have really nice, deep, long roots that reach down into the soil, and they have complex root systems that are really good at holding the soil in place. And so that makes it less likely to experience erosion and other issues like that. They're also good at slowing down and storing water. The buffer of vegetation around a water body is what's known as the floodplain. And the purpose of the floodplain really is to hold water in place and slow it down. And that can actually mitigate the negative impacts of flooding when it happens. Plants are also very good at filtering out contaminants that are found in water. So vegetation directly improves water quality just by the process of the water being processed through the plant. And native plants also increase groundwater recharge, and of course they're important habitat for native fish and wildlife as well. Invasive plants cause issues for water quality because invasive plants don't always have that same really complex root system that our native plants have, which means that they're more likely to experience erosion, which all that increased runoff and sedimentation can impact water quality. They also alter the structure of the floodplain, and so instead of having, like we saw on the last slide, a really good diverse structure to the floodplain, you can have a monoculture where it's just entirely one species, and that may or may not do a good job of holding water in place and storing water like the floodplain is supposed to do. Some invasive plants are also really aggressive, and they can fill stream channels, and that actually will change the way that the water moves through the stream channel, and that can cause issues with flooding or even issues with erosion later downstream, depending on how that water is moving. Some plants are really aggressive, and their roots can cause damage to infrastructure, or they can clog up drainage pipes and culverts and things like that. We also have some invasive species in DFW that actually release chemicals into the soil to prevent other plants from growing, and that can alter the soil chemistry. Some invasive species are very thirsty, and so they soak up a lot of water kind of water hogs, and that can impact water availability, and in some cases can stop springs from flowing. On the management and prevention side of things, there's lots that you can do to prevent invasive species from becoming established. I recommend that you start by conducting site assessments of the properties that you manage. Go out there, take a look, and get a feel for what is there. Is the location predominantly invasive species, or is it a good high quality natural area that's dominated by natives and doesn't really have very many invasive species? Once you go out and look at your sites, you can kind of start to prioritize how, where they should fall in your management activities. A location that has good quality natural habitat that you manage as a natural area should be your highest priority, whereas something that is already overrun with invasives can take a little bit lower priority in terms of your management activities or being targeted for removal later. Those areas that are high quality natural areas already, try to limit the disturbance to those native plant communities, because anytime you disturb those plants or the soil, you're running the risk that a invasive species could come in and capitalize on that and become established. I also recommend that you take the time to train your maintenance staff and your contractors, because you want the people who are doing the direct management on those properties to have some sort of idea of what the plan is. And they don't have to be able to identify every single plant at the site by any means, but you can give them a list and say, like, hey, these are the invasive species that we're really concerned about. Please let us know if you see any of these. Or you can also give them a list of, like, these are some native species that we really want to try to protect. Please avoid this with a mower, or please avoid this area, that type of thing. From there, you want to develop a maintenance plan. A lot of times invasive species are spread through people taking contaminated equipment that has seeds or parts of plants on it from one location to another. And when that happens, it can spread that infestation from one site to another. So if at all possible, in an ideal world, we would use equipment only at one site. I know that's not really realistic for most cities because you have a lot of different properties that you manage. But if you do have a property that's a really high quality natural area that you want to maintain the integrity of, try to at least use equipment specifically at that site. Try to have your own equipment specifically for that one site. If you're visiting multiple sites in a day, plan to visit your high quality, your highest priority sites first, and then kind of work your way down to the lowest priority sites. And that way you lessen the risk of an invasive species being spread to your good quality sites from your lower quality sites. You also want to try and clean your equipment in between sites. Start with clean equipment first thing of the day, but also before you go to a new site, you want to clean off the equipment. So in the field, this can be something kind of quick and easy, like a leaf blower or some sort of hand tool to get the big chunks of vegetation and stuff like that off before you go to a new site. And then when you get back to headquarters at the end of the day, you can clean more thoroughly if you need to. Some other things that you can do is when an area is being developed, make sure that the developer is using native topsoil that came from that site. A lot of developers will use soil that came from somewhere else, and you don't know what sort of seeds are present in that dirt. Also try to use native plants in your landscaping whenever that's possible. Many of our invasive species became established because they were originally planted as ornamentals and they escaped from cultivation. You can also get residents and businesses on board with using native plants by providing them with a list of plants that you recommend. This is especially important if they are near a natural area that you're trying to conserve. When it comes to removing the species, you've got a variety of options. So it's typically going to be some sort of mechanical, manual, or chemical removal, or a combination of those. So it's really just going to depend on the specific species that you're trying to eradicate and also the tools that you have available to you. One other thing that I would mention too is So managing invasive plants is a difficult and time-consuming thing, and I know a lot of cities have a lot of different properties that they manage. So I would really recommend looking into volunteer organizations, because we have lots of great natural resource-focused volunteer organizations here in the DFW area, and they do a lot of good work of removing invasive plants and things like that. So look into your local Master Naturalist chapter, or if any of your parks have friends of groups, those are great resources. I would look into, contact them and see if there's any potential for y'all to partner and say like, hey, we've got a lot of privet popping up in this one area. Do y'all think you could organize a work day and come and help us get rid of some of it? Because we've got a lot of folks across the Metroplex that do stuff like that all the time. Okay, switching gears to animals, I'm gonna talk about 3 types of invasive animals that really cause the most direct and significant impact to water quality. There are certainly lots of other invasive animal species here, but these are the 3 that do the worst in terms of damaging our water quality. So up first are non-native ducks and geese. And these guys are so common and they're everywhere that a lot of people don't really consider them to be an issue because they're just so abundant. But they really do cause a lot of problems, and they have a lot of direct negative impacts on water quality. One of them you can see here in this picture. If you have a lot of ducks and geese in an area, they can trample down that vegetation and leave you with bare dirt, which means you're more likely to have erosion and more runoff as well, which can have negative impacts to your water quality. Next slide, please. The other big issue with ducks and geese is people like to feed them. We've all probably done it at some point in our lives. I know I did it as a kid, but it's really bad to feed ducks. And part of the reason is, as you see in that kind of upper left picture, not all of the food is going to get eaten, so it's left to get all moldy and rot and decompose in the pond. And the other reason is when we feed ducks and geese, we artificially inflate their population beyond what the ecosystem can handle. And that causes issues. That's bad for the ducks. It's also bad for the water body because ducks tend to poop a lot, and a lot of it goes into the water, which can cause issues with bacteria loads as well as nutrient loads and lead to problems like eutrophication and fish kills later down the line. So when it comes to managing ducks and geese, I recommend that you start with outreach and education, because most people who are feeding ducks and geese, like, they're doing it because they think that they're doing a good thing, and they don't realize that it's bad for both the ducks and the environment to feed them. So start out with just an education campaign. I believe COG actually has a toolkit that you can use for social media. But just start with telling people, hey, please don't feed the ducks, and here's why. I also recommend that you get a feeding ordinance in place. And while you're at it, don't just do a feeding ordinance for ducks, but have a feeding ordinance that applies to all wildlife in the city. And the reason why I say that is there's nothing at the state or federal level that prevents feeding of wildlife. That's something that's left to local control. And it's always good just to have it on the books in case you run into an issue down the line, you have something to fall back on in your code. When we're dealing with non-native waterfowl, because they are invasive species, because they are not native to Texas, they do not have any of the strict protections that our native birds do. So you have a lot of flexibility in how you choose to manage these animals. One option is to oil or addle the eggs, which is basically you destroy the embryo, but you leave the egg intact and you leave it in the nest so that the ducks don't relay because they think that they still have viable eggs. And then the other option is to actually trap and remove the ducks, which if you're wanting to see an immediate impact, an immediate improvement in the situation and the water quality, trapping and removing is going to be the best way to go. Up next, we have nutria. Nutria are large rodents. They look a lot like beavers, except they have long, skinny tails instead of that big, flat paddle tail. They're native to South America, and they have some behaviors that make them pretty bad for water quality. They eat, on average, 3 pounds of plants every single day. So they can quickly get rid of vegetation in and around a water body. They also like to create burrows. They dig into the sides of things, and that destabilizes banks and causes erosion, and it can also undermine infrastructure like roads and levees and dams and things like that. They also carry lots of different pathogens and parasites that we don't want getting into our drinking water. Feral hogs are the final species we're going to talk about today. Most of you are probably pretty familiar with feral hogs. They're one of the worst invasive species out there. They also have some behaviors that make them really damaging to water quality. And one is their foraging behavior where they root. So they basically dig up, they kind of make like trenches. They dig up with their snout looking for food, and that displaces the soil and damages vegetation. They also like to wallow in water or muddy areas, which again is going to disturb the soil and kill vegetation, but also while they're rolling around in the mud, they're also peeing and pooping directly into the water body, which is bad in terms of bacteria and nutrient loading, but they're also hosts for over 65 different parasites and pathogens that we really don't want getting into our drinking water. Feral hogs are notoriously prolific. Their population will triple in 5 years if they are left unchecked. And they're also a really expensive species that causes a lot of damage. An estimated $1.5 to $2.5 billion every year. When you're dealing with feral hogs in an urban area, the best course of action is to trap them. And I generally recommend that, if possible, you get a big corral trap that can hold all of the entire sounder at once. And the reason for that is they get pretty trap shy. They're smart. And so, there's kind of a saying that, an uncaught pig is an educated pig. So you want to try and get as many of them at once as possible and really try and eliminate that whole sounder at one time. So when you're dealing with invasive animals, just like invasive plants, it's really important to develop a plan, have a detailed plan in terms of how you're going to trap the animals, and what you're going to do with them after they've been trapped. Then take your plan, and I really recommend that you consult with an animal welfare or health expert. And the reason for that is you can take your plan to them and say, this is what we're going to do. This is why. This is how we're going to handle these animals and process these animals. And they can give you their seal of approval and their blessing. And that's really important to have in the event that someone ever calls into question what you're doing, because people are a lot more likely to be concerned if you're removing animals from an area than if you are removing plants. And so that way, if you ever have anyone concerned about what you're doing, you can say, hey, we came up with a really good plan on how we're going to handle this situation. And we consulted with the Humane Society, or we consulted with our local veterinarian or whoever, and they approve of our plan because they recognize that this is the best situation for our ecosystem and that we're handling these animals as humanely as possible. It's also important to engage in public education and outreach. That way you control the narrative and you can explain to people why you're doing what you're doing and how you're doing it, to address those questions and concerns up front. And then above all, make sure that you emphasize that the reason why you're taking efforts to control invasive species is that by removing the invasive species, we are giving our native plants and animals the opportunity to thrive. And it's also going to help protect our water and ensure that we have good water quality for drinking and swimming and all the things that we like to use water for. And next slide.
Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, thanks. That's it. I don't know if we're going to take questions now or save it for the end, but I've got my email on that slide. So if y'all have anything for me or want any additional information, you can write that down and feel free to send me an email.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for that great information, Rachel. And we will pause for a few minutes for questions for Rachel. If you would like to use the button at the top of your screen, you can raise your hand, or you can just type it in the chat box and I'll read it for everyone. Go ahead and ask your questions.
KR blue stem. How do you get rid of it?
Oh, KR blue stem. Yeah, KR blue stem is a tough one. I'll try and find some links to some websites with some more information about KR bluestem for you. I'll toss that in the chat for anyone who's curious.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace.
Does Texas Parks review management plans?
We definitely can. Yeah, send me an email and I would be happy to look at your management plan.
Awesome. Thank you. And another question, how do you dispose of the trapped animals?
So that depends. You know, if you're dealing with something like feral hogs, you can make the choice to send them to a meat processing plant or donate the meat to, you know, there are some organizations like Hunters for the Hungry or something like that. But, you know, other animals, I guess there might kind of depend on the specific city. You want to find a landfill probably to take them to. I would probably consult with the city because different cities have different city ordinances regarding what they'll accept at their landfill, or they might even have laws that might allow you to bury it on site. It's just going to depend.
Okay, well, we'll move on. We'll move on to our next presenter. Rachel, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so now we are going to shift our discussion to zebra mussels, an invasive and very problematic freshwater mussel from Eurasia. And before I introduce our next speaker, John Tibbs, I wanted to share a map that shows the reservoirs in the 16-county NCTCOG region and highlights those that are infested with zebra mussels to various degrees. So if you look and see the dark purple reservoirs, those are infested with zebra mussels in our region. And that means they have an established reproducing population. And those reservoirs are Ray Roberts, Bridgeport, Eagle Mountain, Grapevine Lake, Louisville Lake, and Richland Chambers Reservoir at the southern end of the region. And we have positive reservoir 1, Lake Lavon, and that means that zebra mussels have been detected more than once. And also the Trinity River classifies as positive. And then there's 1 suspect reservoir in our region, which is Lake Ray Hubbard in the orange. And that means that zebra mussels have been detected 1 time. So I just wanted to show you a map because it's easier to see it visually, I think, than in a list. So hopefully it's helpful to you. And without further ado, let me introduce to you someone who has much more expertise on zebra mussels than I, and that is Mr. John Tibbs. And let me introduce him to you. He is also with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department and has been the Inland Fisheries District Supervisor in Waco, Texas since 1999. John received a master's degree in fish ecology from the University of Missouri. His focus is providing good fishing for anglers in the reservoirs and rivers within his district, as well as working to protect all Texas waters from threats such as invasive aquatic plants and animals. And John, you may begin your presentation, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you all for showing up to this webinar. Really appreciate the opportunity to present this information. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to cover basically a background of the zebra mussels, and then I'm going to follow up with some specifics on how we were able to remove them or eliminate them in Lake Waco, which was, you know, kind of a one-off deal, unfortunately. So I know most of you are acutely aware of these issues, but as I said, I'm going to go over some background information to help put our efforts on Lake Waco kind of in context, as well as provide some background for those who may be new to this issue. Zebra mussels were native to Eurasia, Black and Caspian Sea drainages, but they invaded the United States via ocean-going vessels. Started at the Great Lakes. They provide a significant challenge to folks such as us. Number one, economic impacts. So it's very costly for those responsible for infrastructure, whether they're all kinds of public infrastructure as well as private infrastructure, and those costs have to be passed on to consumers. And so, like I said, a very costly invasive species. And then the ecological impacts. They have a filter plankton, just like any other mussel, which of the food chain. Because they do that, they also count the biomagnify pollutants such as PCBs and metals. So they also pose a significant threat to native mussels because they basically colonize on their shells and they will smother them. And so you can see a picture of that right there. That's a native mussel with a bunch of zebra mussels that have settled on top of it. And then the recreational impacts are pretty obvious to boaters. They foul boat hulls and motors, plug water intake systems. So if you've got your boat out on a slip somewhere, that's what it's going to look like if you leave it in the water for a year or two, as well as the marina itself will have all of its docks and fishing piers covered with zebra mussels. And then a lot of times these will wash up on swimming beaches and so forth, and their shells are incredibly sharp, actually. If you play around with them at all, you're going to cut yourself. So the beaches then become unusable unless you have, some Crocs or something. So not exactly the fun thing to have. So a lot of people aren't sure. They go out and they see some different mussels and they think, well, maybe I found a zebra mussel. And so I wanted to basically just show this basic bit of information here. They're usually less than an inch long. You can also see in the upper right of that slide the little threads that come out of the base of the shell right there, that axis. And those are called byssal threads. And so when they attach to a rock, that's what's holding them in place. Most other mussels will not be attached to rocks. They'll just be simply sitting somewhere. And so it's Asian clams is one that's commonly mistaken for zebra mussels. And as you can see, they look a little different. Zebra mussels are bivalves, just like all the other mollusks, with the exception of snails in this picture. And they're oriented, most mussels are oriented with one shell in the substrate and the other shell on top. But zebra mussels will be attached via the keel, which is actually 90-degree transverse on that, and they're attached with byssal threads. So they're very easy to tell once you know what you're looking at. Now, that being said, the adults are not the only way that these can be transferred around our legs, and they're super hard to control. As adults, they can attach to any kind of hard substrate, but when they spawn, these juveniles, they're called veligers, float around in the water by the thousands until they get big enough to settle. As adults, you actually have the zebra mussels attached to boats that have been in slips. Let's say someone sells that boat and it moves to a new lake, and the marina owner there misses it, and all of a sudden you've got them in the new lake. Or even more threatening, just a boat that spends a few hours on the lake and actually has some bilge water during a spawning period for the zebra mussels might have thousands of little juveniles in that bilge. And so if they go to the lake the next day, but it's a different lake, that's a problem. So it's very sneaky in that it can be transferred many different ways. As I mentioned, barges, boats, recreational equipment, that's the primary method of dispersal by folks. But once you get into a river system, or basically a watershed like the Trinity River, downstream flows from a reservoir will contaminate the rest of the reservoirs. So if you get it in an upper reservoir, all the ones below it are eventually going to get it in some form or fashion. We also have water transfers, which are necessitated by the need for water throughout the state. And so those can also disperse these zebra mussels to new locations. And then fish and animals, for example, catfish species like blue catfish can actually eat them, and they will remain viable, some of them, all the way through the fish. And it's been documented many, many times. So that's an unlikely method of dispersal, but one that can happen nonetheless. And then this basically just shows the North American distribution of zebra and quagga mussels. And as you can see, the red dots, which are the zebra mussels, are the only ones found in Texas at this time. They've basically spread from the north to the south and have entered Texas. So we're now experiencing what the northernmost states experienced, a couple of decades ago. Now, as Elena pointed out, we do have some different water body classifications. We've got infested, which is an established reproducing population, and that's the purple here. I've taken the liberty of marking all of the lakes or reservoirs in the area that have zebra mussels present in them. And so you can easily see them there under the infested. Positive if they've been detected more than once, but they haven't been shown to be reproducing yet. And that's important because Waco was in this particular status. So it wasn't infested yet, but it was positive because we had some adult species, adult zebra mussels in it. And then we have suspect, which is Ray Hubbard. You'll note that Levon and Ray Hubbard are on the East Fork of the Trinity River. So currently, they aren't going to receive any zebra mussels from upstream. So, they might be ones to spend some more effort protecting. And so how are these detected? We've got ongoing monitoring efforts by Texas Parks and Wildlife and our partners. I'm sure some of you are our partners. Don't know who all's on this call, but thank you for everything that you've done so far. You can see that we do a lot of sampling and measuring in a large number of lakes around the state. And at those locations, we will do plankton sampling, which basically will allow us to pull those veliger larvae out of the water if they're present. And we do that twice per year during peak spawning times. So if they are there, they would likely be located. And then those water samples are looked at with microscopes, and we also check for DNA. And so if we do detect DNA, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's live zebra mussels in the lake. It's just that there is zebra mussel DNA in the lake, which could have come from dead zebra mussels or some other thing like that. The other thing that we do is we have settlement samplers out, which is basically hard structures that we can look at, pull up out of the water and see if there's any adults or juveniles that have settled on there. And then rock kick substrate surveys. That's where people can go out around the boat ramps and so forth, turn over rocks and look for juveniles and adults attached to those rocks. And that's actually how we detected the Lake Waco infestation initially. And so with the next slide, that's what I'm going to transition into. And I want to emphasize that the story here is about the partnerships and those that have been developed through many years of working together that enabled us to have a rapid response plan in place that was effective. So it required, good partnerships, a willingness to act, money, and not a little luck. And so I do want to emphasize again, Lake Waco is a special situation where we caught it early and it was conducive to this approach. So remember that as we go through this. So this was our plan, and I just wanted to quickly go over that really quickly so that you understood where we're coming from. So we had prevention, detection, and response components. The prevention was boat inspections and public awareness, and those are our partners there that we had. And I'll detail a little bit about that, but we had the city of Waco with some interns that they had out at the boat ramps informing people about clean, drain, dry. We had these clean, drain, dry signs out everywhere. And we had a lot of brochures that we handed out. And we interfaced with, around 1,200 boat owners and boaters every summer with this program. So it was very successful with about 90% of the people after the first year who were interviewed already knowing about zebra mussels. So it was very effective at getting the word out there directly to the boaters that would be the most likely vector for this invasive species. We also had detection work that we had ongoing. We had lots of volunteers. We had trained the city of Waco employees to go out and do this. And we were outgoing and doing that. And we had Baylor University interns doing that kind of stuff. And then the response portion we'll talk about here in a minute. So this was on all the literature that we were putting out and in everything that we told to the public. You know, it's a catchy slogan. You probably all heard it many times. And, you know, most people actually remember it. It's clean, drain, dry. And it's effective for not just zebra mussels, but any invasive species that might be housed on a boat or a boat trailer. And so this was kind of not just a twofer, but a three or a fourfer, because we have other native or non-native vegetation issues. Rachel referred to that, and that is a problem around the state. So educating people about it is something that is very useful at any time you get that opportunity. The other thing that our interns were able to do was actually define risk a little bit, which was important because we never really realized in many ways how many different areas that a boater might come from for a particular reservoir. We had some of this information for our anglers, but we didn't necessarily have it for all boaters. And so all of these little triangles on here were reservoirs where we had interns, and they were defining where people were coming from to boat in that reservoir. And they were also defining those reservoirs where they had been before. So it was a way to actually quantify risk for certain reservoirs, which could be used in the future for planning on how you might actually address this issue and make sure that you have people aware of the problems that they may cause if they bring the zebra mussels. So on to our specific Lake Waco example. On September 26, 2014, the mussels were first documented at a boat ramp on Lake Waco, and it just happened to be the Country Club boat ramp. As it turns out, a barge had come in to do some repairs, and they had zebra mussels on them. They should have known better, but a City of Waco employee who was not a zebra mussel specialist, just worked for the city, but was interested in helping out, actually located the first zebra mussel right next to the boat ramp and sent us a picture. And so I want to emphasize that it doesn't take a lot of training to identify these zebra mussels and actually give us as much notice as possible. In this case, it made all of the difference. So in a few days later, we went out and actually quantified how many zebra mussels were out there. We managed to remove several dozen and figure out exactly where they all were. And so we had additional surveys, including those by scuba divers. And we also did a lot of DNA sampling around there, plankton sampling, that kind of stuff. And we found that there was absolutely no reproduction occurring. And so that was important because we knew then that we were dealing with a brand new population that had just been dropped in the lake. We were able to quantify when that was from the people that brought in the barge. And so the partners met, and we decided to try covering the area with heavy tarps to suffocate these zebra mussels. This was enabled by the fact that the actual location of the zebra mussels and that boat ramp was a nice gradual slope with very little problems, chunks of tree and boulders and stuff that was in the way. So we were going to be able to actually put these tarps out and get a good coverage with it without it getting torn up. All of the partners had something to do. The Corps of Engineers cleared the way for it by getting the permits that we needed. The city, who was not bounded by lowest bid and all these other issues, were able to order the tarps pronto. We got the tarps in, and we finished the job on October 23rd, which was less than a month after the initial identification of zebra mussels, and that's pretty darn rapid response by most measures, considering all of the players that were involved in this situation. And this is just some of how it was actually done. They were unrolled. You can see the people there doing that, and then they were pulled out into the lake with boats. And then we had commercial divers. We were delivering sand bags to them from the surface down to them, and they were placing them on the tarps to hold them in place. And 2,000 sandbags is a lot of sandbags, just going to say. And of course, you can't just put a bunch of tarps in the lake and not get them back out. So in mid-March the following year, we did remove them and documented what appeared to have been good anoxic conditions. Underneath those tarps, there's a lot of black slime and stuff and hydrogen sulfide smell. So it looked like we achieved what we needed. And we only found one zebra mussel, which may have been alive, but we're not really sure. And after that, we didn't document any others around there. So for the next 5 years, we sampled twice per year with the approaches that I previously identified. And we haven't found any larvae, adults, or DNA. So at this point, Lake Waco has been returned to undetected negative status, which is fantastic. It's the only reservoir in Texas that we were able to do that with. Very lucky that we were able to accomplish this. It wasn't all luck. There was a lot of good hard work by a lot of good hard working people, but this is not something that can be used in every situation where zebra mussels are identified. For example, if the zebra mussels are reproducing, it's already too late. So early detection is the key. And so even though we've eradicated it in Lake Waco or eradicated zebra mussels in Lake Waco, we're still have ongoing prevention and detection efforts. So it's just going to be a continuing thing with that reservoir. The other thing about that reservoir is that it's the only reservoir on the Bosque River system. So if we can keep zebra mussels out of that reservoir, it won't be coming in from upstream because there are no other reservoirs upstream from it. And so that's another consideration when looking at reservoirs around the DFW area as to how you might approach them as well. And so the summary points that I wanted to make sure I covered, prevention and detection efforts remain the most effective way to slow the spread of zebra mussels. And so we've got those ongoing every year. And those generally are providing billboards, things like that, and just trying to raise awareness of the problems that the zebra mussels can cause if they get into a reservoir. So success stories like Lake Waco are extremely rare. And as I said, early detection is the key. And, once one reservoir and a watershed is infested, downstream reservoirs are next. And so we just need to remain vigilant. And, that requires a lot of work by a lot of different people. And of course, Texas Parks and Wildlife has an aquatic invasives team that is handling a lot of those high level stuff. I'm a biologist in one of 5 different districts that helps manage the fisheries and the lakes in this 16 county area. So we do have a few people, a few resources for y'all to rely on. And if you have any questions, we can certainly answer them at this time.
Thank you so much, John. That was great information. Thank you for sharing. I see a question already. What did this effort cost?
Well, that's a good question. I will say that the city of Waco actually bore the brunt of the cost. They purchased the tarps, and I can't remember the exact figure, but I suspect it was close to 6 figures. Not a lot in the grand scheme of things. When you're talking about a reservoir and all of the costs associated with zebra mussels. But I don't have an exact figure. I apologize.
Can the tarps be reused in other ways?
Yeah, actually, the tarps when we pulled them out, they were retained. A little background on them: they're actually pond liners. So their normal function would be to line leaky ponds in order to keep them from going dry during droughts. So they were actually retained by the city in the offhand chance that we needed them again. So as far as I know, they're still in storage, which is a good thing.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question. What kind of preventive motioning would you recommend for a reservoir? Motioning.
So for preventative monitoring, we 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 have a lot of uh, information that we can provide to people. So, for example, what we would do is we'd go around to all the marinas and we'd provide them with some literature and so forth because that is a vector. We also Parks and Wildlife would put out billboards and things like that, and you might see those out and about, clean, drain, dry. Um, what a partner could do, it depends on what your approach might be and how you might be able to facilitate that. But for example, if you have a group of people that you're servicing either through water or something like that, you can include that kind of information in bills or invoices or whatever. Just hey, clean, drain, dry. You could consider if you're actually in charge of some infrastructure or something like that on a reservoir that's not yet infested. You could potentially have some interns that would go out and provide some information to boaters. We've had some work like that done. So there's a few ways to do it, and I would urge that if you want some more specifics, that you would contact our aquatic invasive coordinator. Her address was at the very first slide here, and she could give you some specifics of how we might be able to work with you.
Okay, here's a question, John. You left the tarps in place for about 5 months. Were other species affected that might spawn in shallow water?
That's a good question. I want to emphasize, this is about a 9,000 acre reservoir, and we covered up less than an acre along the shoreline. And so, yes, anything that would have used that habitat at that time would not have been able to use it. But we've been blessed with Lake Waco in 2004. The water levels were actually raised. And so we have an abundance of aquatic habitat out there at this time, which has resulted in some great fishing. There's a plug for everyone. But so we didn't consider it to be as large an issue as the zebra mussels themselves. So thanks for that question.
Okay, here's another one. How long did it take for this area to rebound?
Oh, it was almost instantaneous. It was really great. We took out the tarps, and it was like it never happened. Leave no trace, that kind of stuff. So it was really nice. We have seen as I said before, we've seen fish populations are very strong in this reservoir, and of course the facilities are great. So we haven't had any issues.
I have a question, John. Is there anything that can be done to manage zebra mussels in a lake that's already infested?
Wow, that is a good question. So, we've got some ongoing research, and there's more that's being funded all the time about zebra mussel biology, because as you might expect from looking at the map, we are in its extreme southern range. And so we're seeing, some evidence that there's some boom bust cycles of zebra mussels. And so that they might be really abundant at one point, and then they might drop back to very low levels, and then they might come back. And so that basic information is needed to address the question you just brought up. It's like we need to know what we're looking at, what we're dealing with, and how we might be able to influence this. We've seen some changes in fish populations because of it, some positive, some negative. And so, there's the chance that, nature may actually be addressing this problem a little bit on its own too. For example, I mentioned blue catfish love to eat them. Red ear sunfish love to eat them. Freshwater drum love to eat them. Does that make them great? Absolutely not. But you know, there's a lot of different ways that this zebra mussels are interfacing with the existing biology that's out there that we're not really sure and we don't have a good handle on yet.
Well, thank you. And it is 3 o'clock, so we need to wrap up. A huge thank you again to all of you for joining us, and to our speakers, Rachel Richter and John Tibbs, for taking the time to present their knowledge with us today. And this webinar is now over.